Before we start, if you enjoy the story, please leave a like and check if you're subscribed. The whiskey tasted like recycled coolant, but Elias Crane drank it anyway. 300 credits left to his name, and half of that would go to docking fees if he didn't vacate his berth by morning. The bar on Anchorage Station smelled of industrial solvent and desperation, his kind of place lately. Captain Crane. The voice came from behind him, formal and clipped. Elias didn't turn. Captains commanded ships, and he hadn't done that in 18 months. Not since the nav error that sent 3 good people into a stellar corona because he'd been too tired, too arrogant, too sure of his mental math. Just Crane, he said. The man who circled into view wore station security gray, but the insignia on his collar belonged to no human authority. Zentari Diplomatic Corps. Elias's hand tightened on his glass. Baron Velrith Velterim requests your presence. He has a business proposal. Tell the Baron I'm not interested in Zentari business. He anticipated your response. The diplomat placed a credit chit on the bar. 5,000 simply for the meeting, whether you accept his offer or not. Elias looked at the chit. 5,000 would buy 3 months of docking fees, food, and enough whiskey to forget why he needed either. He picked it up. The Baron's suite occupied an entire spoke of the station's executive ring, the kind of space that cost more per night than Elias earned in a year back when he'd earned anything. Velrith himself stood at the viewport, his tall frame silhouetted against the stellar backdrop. His emerald skin seemed to absorb the starlight rather than reflect it. Captain Crane. The Baron turned and his smile held no warmth. Thank you for coming. I have a proposition that should appeal to a man of your reduced circumstances. Elias crossed his arms. I'm listening. My daughter requires transport, specialized transport. Velrith gestured to a side chamber, and the door dilated. For 1 contract cycle, 6 standard months, you will take her as crew aboard your vessel. Complete 10 salvage contracts during that time, and I will transfer full ownership of a Frontier-class salvage ship to you. Fail, and you receive nothing. Why would your daughter need... Come meet her. The chamber beyond held medical equipment, environmental monitors, and a mobility chair that looked more like a throne designed by engineers. The woman seated within it took Elias's breath away for exactly 3 seconds before he noticed the rigid stillness of her body, the way her head rested against the chair's support, the absolute absence of movement below her neck. She was beautiful, high cheekbones, full lips, black hair cascading past shoulders that didn't shift as he entered, but her eyes tracked him with an intensity that made his spine straighten, dark eyes that held intelligence and something else. Fury, maybe? Or pain so old it had calcified into armor. This is Serath Veltarim, the Baron said, my eldest daughter. As you can see, she suffers from a neural condition that has left her limited. Her mind is functional enough for basic comprehension, but she cannot speak, cannot move, cannot contribute meaningfully to any endeavor. I expect this will demonstrate itself quickly. The Baron's tone carried casual cruelty that made Elias's jaw clench. He'd heard that tone before from officers who sent crews into danger they'd never faced themselves. Elias asked, Excuse me? Why put her through this? Why humiliate her? Velrith's expression hardened. You misunderstand, Captain. This is an opportunity for both of you. She receives experience beyond her sheltered existence. You receive a ship. Consider it charitable employment. Elias looked at Serath again. Her eyes hadn't left his face, and something in that gaze told him she understood every word, felt every razor edge of her father's contempt. He thought about walking away, about his 300 credits and the long slide into nothing that waited outside these expensive walls. He thought about how those 3 crew members had looked at him with trust right before his mistake killed them. 6 months, Elias said. 10 contracts, then the ship is mine with full documentation. Agreed? And she's crew, not cargo. I don't take passengers. Velrith's laugh was soft and mocking. As you wish, Captain. Treat her as crew. I'm certain that will be educational. 2 days later, Serath arrived at Elias's rented dock bay in her mobility chair, accompanied by a medical technician who spent 15 minutes explaining care protocols, Elias barely absorbed before departing. He stood in the cargo bay of his leased salvage runner, staring at a woman whose beauty hadn't diminished, but whose presence now filled him with something approaching dread. "So," he said, then stopped. "What did you say to someone who couldn't answer? Welcome aboard, I guess." Her eyes met his, and he saw the flash of frustration there before she deliberately looked away, focusing on the bulkhead behind him. The dismissal stung more than it should have. The first salvage contract took them to a derelict research station spinning slowly in the debris field of a failed colony. Elias spent 6 hours plotting a safe approach vector through the wreckage, his fingers cramping on the manual controls as he calculated thrust angles and drift compensation. The navigation computer kept spitting back error codes, claiming insufficient data for automated plotting. Useless piece of... He slammed his palm against the console, then immediately regretted it when he heard a sound behind him. A click deliberate from Sarath's throat. He turned. She'd positioned her chair where she could see his navigation screen, and her eyes were moving with rapid precision, tracking across the stellar map, darting to specific coordinates, then back to his face with an urgency that demanded attention. "You want to tell me something," he said slowly. Her eyes moved up. "Yes. About the navigation?" "Up again?" Elias pulled up the coordinate display. "Show me." Her gaze locked onto a specific point in the debris field, held for 2 seconds, then moved to another coordinate. Then another. 3 points that formed a vector he would never have considered, threading between wreckage clusters in a way that seemed reckless until he ran the calculations and realized it would cut their approach time by 3 hours and reduce their fuel consumption by 20%. He stared at the screen, then at her. "You did that math in your head?" Her eyes moved up, and this time he saw something else in them. Not frustration. Vindication. Elias input her coordinates, watching the navigation computer verify what she'd calculated in seconds while he'd struggled for hours. The ship's thrusters fired in sequence, and they slipped through the debris field like water through fingers. "Holy hell," he breathed. He spent the entire salvage operation thinking about what he'd seen. About the intelligence burning behind eyes everyone assumed saw nothing important. About how quickly she'd solved a problem that had defeated him and his equipment. That night, he began sketching modifications to the ship's interface systems, eye-tracking technology, direct neural interfaces adapted for limited mobility, ways to let her communicate beyond yes and no. Sarath watched him work from her chair, positioned where she could see his designs, and when he finally looked up and met her gaze, he saw something that might have been hope. "You're not what he thinks you are," Elias said quietly. "Are you?" Her eyes moved up. "Then let's prove it." The interface went live on their 4th salvage run. Elias had spent 3 weeks rebuilding the navigation console, cannibalizing parts from 6 different systems, and trading favors he couldn't afford to acquire the specialized eye-tracking sensors. The work consumed his nights while Sarath watched, her gaze following his hands as he soldered connections and reconfigured data pathways. When he finally powered up the system and text appeared on the secondary screen, her text, formed by eye movements and deliberate focus, his chest tightened with something he couldn't name. The first message read, "Your coolant routing is inefficient. Reroute through secondary manifold." Elias laughed, the sound rusty from disuse. "Nice to meet you, too." "We met 2 weeks ago. Pay attention." "Did you just..." He turned to look at her, finding one corner of her mouth lifted in what might have been a smile. "Are you making jokes now?" Always made jokes, you couldn't hear them. Something shifted between them in that moment. She wasn't a passenger anymore, wasn't a burden his desperation had forced him to carry. She was Sarath, sharp and wry and trapped in a body that had silenced her for too long. He rerouted the coolant system. She was right. It improved efficiency by 12%. The salvage contracts came steadily after that. Elias handled the physical work, cutting through bulkheads, securing cargo, managing the unpredictable dangers of derelict vessels, while Sarath calculated every jump, every approach vector, every escape trajectory, with precision that bordered on precognition. They developed a rhythm that felt less like cooperation and more like synchronization. Between jobs, during the long hours in hyperspace when the universe contracted to just the ship and themselves, they talked. Or rather, Elias talked, while Sarath typed responses that appeared on screens throughout the ship he'd networked for her convenience. He told her about growing up on a water harvest station where every drop was measured and every mistake could kill a colony. About learning navigation, because the emptiness between stars felt cleaner than the cramped desperation of survival. About the crew he'd killed through arrogance disguised as confidence. She told him about childhood in a family that treated her condition as shameful proof of genetic weakness. About tutors who'd given up when she couldn't respond in expected ways. About understanding every conversation that happened around her, while everyone assumed she comprehended nothing. They discussed my care like I was furniture, she typed one night, debated whether maintaining me was worth the resources. Elias had been checking fuel reserves when that message appeared, his hands stilled on the controls. Sareth? My father wanted to institutionalize me. My mother refused. She died 4 years ago. Now he tolerates my existence because abandoning me would damage his reputation more than keeping me does. He crossed the narrow cockpit and crouched beside her chair, bringing his eyes level with hers. You're not furniture. You're the best navigator I've ever worked with. You've only worked with navigation computers. This time her smile was unmistakable, and it transformed her face from beautiful to something that made his pulse stumble. He started making other modifications. Environmental controls adjusted to Zentari preferences, slightly higher humidity, different light spectrum. He fabricated a direct interface port so her chair could integrate with the ship's systems, giving her access to more than just navigation. Sensors, communications, even defensive systems. You're part of the ship now, he explained as he installed the final connections. If something happens to me during salvage ops, you can still fly her. Get yourself out. Why would you do that? Because you're crew. Crew takes care of each other. Her eyes held his for a long moment, and he felt the weight of her gaze like a physical touch. The pirates found them during their 7th contract at a derelict military transport that should have been stripped clean decades ago. Elias was inside the wreck, cutting through a sealed compartment, when Sarath's voice came through his helmet comm, actual voice, transmitted through the interface he'd rigged to her throat sensors. 3 ships armed 2 minutes out. Her words were synthesized, mechanical, but hearing her warn him made his heart slam against his ribs for reasons that had nothing to do with danger. Copy coming out now. No time. They'll catch us in dock, calculating emergency jump. Elias ran through the transport's corridors, magnetic boots pounding against deck plating. Sarath, we can't jump from inside the debris field. We can, threading between the gravitational wells, narrow window. He hit the airlock as weapons fire sparked against the transport's hull. Through his helmet display, he saw the 3 pirate vessels closing fast, their targeting systems painting his ship. Elias. Her synthesized voice held something that might have been fear. Trust me. He sealed the airlock and started the engine sequence, his hands moving on instinct while his mind screamed that what she was proposing violated every safety protocol. Threading between 2 gravitational sources during jump entry meant miscalculating by even fractions of a degree would tear them apart at the molecular level. Jump coordinates locked, her voice said. Execute on my mark. The pirates opened fire. Elias's fingers hovered over the jump control. Mark. He executed. The universe twisted. Gravity pulled in 6 directions simultaneously. The ship's hull groaned, as forces that shouldn't coexist tried to unmake every rivet and weld. Elias's vision grayed at the edges, his body compressed and stretched by tidal forces that should have killed them. Then they were through, dropping into normal space light years from danger, and Elias was shaking so hard he had to grip the console to stay upright. Status? We're alive. He forced his breathing to slow. How did you? Nobody could calculate that fast. I could. He turned to look at her. Her face was pale, her eyes enormous, and he saw the tremor in her fingers, the only part of her that could sometimes move. She was terrified, had been terrified. But she'd done it anyway. Elias crossed to her chair and did something he'd never done before. He rested his hand on her shoulder, feeling the warmth of her skin through the thin fabric of her clothing, feeling the rapid flutter of her pulse beneath his palm. "You saved us," he said quietly. "I couldn't stand beside you when the danger came," she typed with her eyes even as he touched her. "That's what frustrates me, not the fear, the helplessness." "You weren't helpless, you were—" He struggled for words. "You were everything." Her eyes found his, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with navigation or partnership or gratitude. Something that made his hand tighten on her shoulder before he caught himself and stepped back, professional distance reasserting itself like a safety protocol. But the damage was done. He knew it, and from the way she looked at him, she knew it too. That night, during ship's night cycle when he should have been sleeping, Elias sat at the console researching Zentari medical facilities. Treatment options, neural specialists, anything that might help her reclaim more than just her voice. He didn't hear Sarath's chair approach until her synthesized voice spoke softly. "What are you doing?" He didn't lie, looking for ways to help you. "Why?" "Because," he stopped, started again, "because you deserve better than this, better than him, better than—" "Better than you?" "I didn't say that." "You were thinking it." Before he could respond, an alert chimed. Incoming message, encrypted, from an unknown source. Elias opened it and medical data spilled across his screen, genetic research, neural suppression protocols, historical documentation. He read in growing horror, while Sarath watched silently behind him. When he finally turned to face her, his expression must have said everything. "Your condition," he said, "it's not natural. Someone did this to you." Her eyes went wide, then moved rapidly across the data he displayed for her. He watched her read her own medical profile, saw understanding and fury, and something that looked like relief war across her expressive features. "Who sent this?" she typed. "I don't know, but we're going to find out." He stood, his hands clenched into fists, "and then we're going to make this right." The response came 3 hours later. Not an answer to his message, but a summons from Baron Velrith. The contract cycle was complete. Sarath was to return home immediately. Elias looked at her across the cockpit that had become their shared space and saw his own dread reflected in her dark eyes. "I don't want to go back," she typed. "I know," he said, "neither do I." Neither of them said what both understood. They weren't just talking about the contract anymore. The encrypted file contained 20 years of suppressed research. Elias read through the night while Sarath absorbed every word through her interface. And by morning they both understood the truth. Her paralysis wasn't a random neural syndrome. It was engineered suppression targeting specific gene sequences found exclusively in Zentari noble females. "Why?" she typed, her cursor blinking with unusual slowness as if the question exhausted her. "Because you're dangerous." Elias pulled up the cognitive analysis data. Noble caste females have enhanced spatial reasoning, pattern recognition, strategic processing, abilities that would threaten patriarchal control, she finished. "They crippled us to keep us powerless." He wanted to destroy something, wanted to tear apart the systems that had stolen her life. But Sarath's next message stopped him. "Don't confront my father. He probably doesn't know. And if he does, revealing this publicly could start a civil war, or get me killed quietly. So we do nothing? We're careful." The Zentari homeworld station loomed like a judgment in the viewport. All gleaming spires and diplomatic grandeur, beautiful in the way monuments to power always were. Elias docked in the visitor's bay and watched security personnel collect Sarath like cargo being reclaimed. She looked back at him once before the transport sealed, and her eyes held everything they couldn't say aloud. He stood in his empty ship afterward, surrounded by her modifications and her absence, and felt the hollow ache of it settle into his bones. 3 days later, he met Cale Vorston in a maintenance sector that smelled of ozone and industrial lubricant. The Zentari engineer was younger than Elias expected, with lighter green skin and a scar bisecting his left eye that spoke of accidents in places where safety was negotiable. You received my file, Kale said without preamble. You're the source? I'm part of a reform movement. Small, careful. We've been documenting the suppression protocol for years, but we lack proof significant enough to challenge the ruling families without triggering exactly the violence Sereth warned you about. Elias leaned against a coolant manifold. What do you need? Someone willing to break the silence. Someone the Confederation would listen to. A human perspective carries weight. Our own people's testimony doesn't. You're outside our political structure. Kale's expression hardened. But mostly we need Sereth, a living example, proof that these women deserve more than the prison of their own bodies. She's locked in her family compound. I know. I also know you care for her. Kale met his gaze steadily. The way you modified your ship, the interface systems, the environmental controls, that wasn't just professional courtesy. You see her. Elias said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. There's a doctor, Kale continued. Dr. Imani Okoye, human, works a frontier medical station. She's analyzed the suppression mechanism. She believes it can be reversed, but the procedure is dangerous. Neural pathways reconnecting after years of forced dormancy, the pain would be severe, recovery uncertain, and it would require Sereth's consent. Get me away into the Veltarum compound. Kale pulled out a data chip. Security override codes. They'll get you past the outer checkpoints, but once you're inside, you're exposed. If Velrith catches you, he can claim trespass and hold you indefinitely. The Confederation won't intervene in internal family matters. Elias took the chip, then I won't get caught. In her quarters, Sereth endured her father's satisfaction like she endured everything else, with silent observation and mounting fury. Baron Velrith visited daily to comment on her educational experience with the human, his tone making clear he'd considered the entire arrangement a successful humiliation. 6 months of pretending usefulness, he said on the third day. I trust it taught you the reality of your limitations. She couldn't respond. Her interface was gone, her chair's systems locked to basic mobility only. The silence she'd escaped had reclaimed her, and the weight of it pressed against her chest like physical force. Her younger sister Nayla visited that evening, slipping past the guards with practiced ease. She was 16, still healthy, still whole, and she looked at Sereth with the uncomfortable pity that made Sereth want to scream. Father's pleased the experiment ended, Nayla said, arranging flowers in a vase Sereth couldn't reach. He said you'd come home understanding your place better. Sereth could only stare, trapped behind eyes that held everything she wanted to say. I remember when you were younger, Nayla continued. Before the condition worsened. Mother wanted to try treatment then. Specialists from the medical consortium. Father refused, he said. She paused, uncomfortable. He said the cost wasn't justified for a daughter who'd never contribute meaningfully to the family legacy. Something cold settled in Sereth's chest. Her father had known, had chosen this for her, had watched her decline and done nothing because her existence as she was suited him better than her potential. Nayla left, and Sereth sat in her chair surrounded by luxury she couldn't enjoy, freedom she couldn't access, and rage she couldn't express. Until her door opened again, and Elias Crane stood in the entrance like an answer to prayers she hadn't known she was offering. He looked wrong here, too rough, too human, too real, amid all this polished grandeur. But when his eyes found hers, relief transformed his face into something that made her heart stutter. Hey, he said quietly, crossing to her. Miss me? She couldn't answer, couldn't type, couldn't do anything but hold his gaze while something fierce and desperate built behind her ribs. He knelt beside her chair, bringing himself to her eye level, and pulled out a portable interface device. Borrowed this from Kale. It's not integrated like your ship systems, but... Her eyes were already moving, spelling out words with the determination of someone who'd been silenced too long. How did you get in here? Poorly thought out rescue attempt. We should probably leave before security notices. Elias, I found a doctor. Someone who can help reverse the suppression. It won't be easy. Might not even work completely, but it's a chance. He paused and his voice softened. I'm not here to make decisions for you. I'm here to ask what you want. Not what's safe, not what's expected. What you actually want. Sereth looked at him, this human who'd seen her when no one else had, who'd built her interfaces and given her voice and treated her like she mattered. She thought about her father's satisfaction, about spending the rest of her life as decoration in a beautiful cage, about the other women suffering the same fate because no one had fought for them. She thought about standing, about speaking, about living instead of just existing. Her eyes moved with deliberate precision across the interface. "Get me out." Elias smiled, fierce and determined. "That's my girl." He lifted her from the chair. She weighed less than he expected, her body light in his arms, and carried her toward the door. Alarms started wailing before they reached it. Security protocols Kale's codes couldn't bypass. "Hold on," Elias said, and ran. The compound's corridors became a maze of pursuit. Guards shouted behind them. Bulkhead doors sealed ahead. But Elias had spent years navigating derelict ships in the dark, and he moved through the architecture like water finding cracks. They burst into the docking bay where his ship waited, engines already hot because he'd never really believed this would work, and wanted an escape route ready. He secured Serath in the navigator's seat, her seat now, always, and slammed his hands onto the controls. The ship launched as security forces breached the bay doors. Weapons fire scored their hull. Baron Velrith's voice thundered through every comm channel, demanding Elias's arrest, promising consequences, threatening everything. Elias executed the jump Serath had calculated before they'd even arrived, because of course she'd calculated an escape vector, because she'd known this moment would come, and the station disappeared behind them as hyperspace embraced the ship like forgiveness. In the sudden quiet, Elias turned to look at her. She was crying, tears streaming down her face, but her eyes held something that looked like joy. He reached across the narrow cockpit and took her hand, feeling the faint tremor in her fingers that was all the movement she could manage. She squeezed back with everything she had. "No going back now," he said. Her eyes moved to the interface he'd secured to her chair. "Good," she typed. "I never wanted to go back, I wanted to go forward." "Then let's fly." The Frontier Medical Station orbited a dim red star that barely qualified as inhabitable space. Dr. Imani Okoye met them at the dock, her expression grave as she examined Serath's condition and reviewed the genetic data Kale had provided. "The suppressor works by blocking neural transmitter production at the genetic level," she explained, her voice clinically precise. "Reversing it means reactivating dormant pathways that haven't functioned in years. The reconnection process will be painful, extremely painful. Your nervous system will essentially relearn how to communicate with itself, and there are no guarantees about final mobility levels." Serath's eyes moved across her interface. "How long?" "Initial treatment takes 6 hours. Recovery could take months. The first 72 hours will be the worst. Your body won't know how to process the sensory input it's receiving. Pain signals, temperature, pressure, all of it flooding through channels that have been silent." Dr. Okoye's gaze held compassion alongside honesty. "I need to know you understand what you're choosing." "I understand," Serath typed. "I choose this. Then we begin tomorrow. You should rest." But Serath didn't rest. She spent the night with Elias in the ship, their ship, talking through the interface about everything and nothing. He told her about the salvage contracts he'd been researching, the routes they could run together. She told him about Zentari literature, music, the culture she'd observed but never participated in. "I'm afraid," she finally typed as ship's night cycle deepened around them. "Of the pain. Of failing, of going through this and still being trapped." Elias moved to kneel beside her chair, his hand finding hers where it rested against the armrest. Her fingers trembled against his palm. "You won't be trapped," he said. "Even if nothing changes physically, you're not trapped anymore. You chose this. You chose to fight. That's freedom, Serath." Her eyes held his in the dim cockpit lighting. "Will you stay during the procedure?" "I'm not going anywhere." The treatment began at dawn station time. Dr. Okoye administered the genetic catalyst through a series of injections, while a Zentari specialist, an older female doctor who'd fled her homeworld years ago, monitored neural activity. Elias stood at Serath's side, her hand gripped in his, and watched as the medications entered her system. For the first hour, nothing visible changed. Then Sereth's eyes widened, her breath catching, and her entire body went rigid with a tension that looked like agony crystallized. "The pathways are reconnecting," Dr. Okoye said quietly. "Sereth, can you hear me?" Sereth's fingers spasmed against Elias's hand. Not the faint tremor he'd grown accustomed to, but a violent jerking that spoke of nerves firing without pattern or control. Her face contorted, tears streaming from her eyes, and a sound tore from her throat. Not synthesized, real. A raw cry of pain that made Elias's chest constrict. "I'm here," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. "I've got you, just breathe." The hours that followed were worse than any salvage operation gone wrong, worse than the moment he'd watched his crew die. Sereth's body convulsed as her nervous system came alive. She couldn't speak, couldn't control the movement, couldn't do anything but endure while her neurons remembered how to fire and her muscles remembered how to respond. Elias talked to her through all of it, told her about the first time he'd seen a stellar nursery up close, about his mother's water harvest songs, about the way Starlight looked through a nebula's dust. His voice became her anchor, the only constant in a world of overwhelming sensation. On the second day, her hand closed around his deliberately. Not a spasm, a choice. The pressure was weak, uncoordinated, but intentional. "That's it," he breathed. "You're doing it." By the third day, the violent convulsions had subsided into persistent tremors. Sereth lay in the medical bay, her body exhausted, her face drawn with pain, but her eyes tracked him with clear focus when he entered the room. He pulled a chair beside her bed and took her hand again. She squeezed back, stronger than before. "Hey," he said softly. Her lips moved, sound emerged, rough and barely audible, but unmistakably her own voice. "Hey!" Elias pressed his forehead to their joined hands, overwhelmed by relief so intense it felt like drowning. The respite lasted 6 hours before Baron Velrith arrived. The Baron swept into the medical station with security forces and diplomatic authority, demanding Sereth's immediate return. Dr. Okoye blocked the medical bay entrance with calm professionalism. "My patient isn't cleared for transport," she said. "Your patient is my daughter and Zentari property." "I'm not property." Sereth's voice cut through the confrontation, stronger than it should have been given her condition. She sat in the medical bed, supported by pillows but upright, and her eyes blazed with fury that had been building for 27 years. "I'm not yours, not anymore." Velrith's expression hardened. "You're confused. The human has filled your head with—" "You knew." Her words came slowly, each one deliberate. "When I was young, when treatment was possible, you refused. You chose this for me." Something flickered across the Baron's face. Not quite guilt, but close enough to confirm the accusation. "I chose what was best for our family, for our people. Noble females with full cognitive function threaten the social structure that has maintained Zentari stability for generations." "You mean they threaten your power?" "I mean they threaten chaos." Velrith's voice rose. "Do you understand what you've done, what he's convinced you to do? You've made yourself a symbol, a catalyst for upheaval that could tear our society apart." "Good," Sereth said. The word hung in the air like a detonation. Kale chose that moment to broadcast. Every major Confederation channel, every diplomatic network, every public feed simultaneously lit up with the genetic research data, the suppression protocols, the historical documentation of how Zentari society had systematically crippled its own women for centuries. The reform movement struck with precision that came from years of preparation. Noble families scrambled to deny involvement. Political alliances fractured. And Baron Velrith stood in the medical bay, watching his daughter's choice destroy everything he'd worked to maintain. "You've betrayed your people," he said quietly. "No," Sereth replied, "I freed them." Velrith left without another word, his security forces trailing behind him. The diplomatic immunity that had protected him couldn't survive the evidence now spreading through Confederation space. 3 months later, Sereth walked onto Elias's ship. Her gait was careful, each step requiring concentration. She wore mobility braces on both legs, and fatigue still hit her faster than either of them liked. But she walked. She spoke. She was present in her body in ways she'd never been before. Elias watched from the cargo bay as she made her way up the ramp, his heart doing complicated things in his chest that had nothing to do with navigation or partnership or gratitude. She reached the top and paused, one hand braced against the bulkhead, breathing hard from the exertion. Then she smiled, that transforming smile that lit up her entire face, and he forgot about everything except how much he wanted to close the distance between them. "Permission to come aboard?" she asked, her voice still carrying the slight roughness that might never completely fade. "Always." She crossed the bay on her own power, refusing his offered hand until she stood directly in front of him. This close, he could see the green luminescence of her skin, the way her eyes held him, like he was something worth keeping. "I've been thinking," she said. "Dangerous habit. About partnerships, about what we've built." She reached up with deliberate care and touched his face, her fingers tracing his jaw with the wonder of someone experiencing touch in a completely new way. "About what I want." Elias stood perfectly still, hardly breathing, while she explored the texture of his stubble, the line of his cheekbone, the shape of his mouth. "And what do you want?" he asked quietly. This, everything we haven't said yet." Her hand settled against his chest, feeling his heartbeat. "I want to navigate beside you, stand with you, fight with you, love you if you'll have me." He covered her hand with his, holding it against his heart. "Sarath, is that a yes?" "That's a yes to everything. Always yes." She rose onto her toes, the movement still uncertain but determined, and kissed him. Soft and careful and perfect, tasting like hope and hard-won freedom and the beginning of something they'd both stopped believing they deserved. When they finally broke apart, she was laughing breathlessly, leaning against him for support. "Ready to fly?" he asked. She looked past him to the cockpit, to the navigator's seat that had always been hers, to the stars waiting beyond the viewport. "With you?" She laced her fingers through his. "Anywhere." They walked forward together into the ship that was theirs, into the life they'd fought for, into a future where seeing someone meant fighting beside them until they could see themselves. The engines hummed to life beneath their feet, and the stars called them home.